Under a velvet sky thick with clouds, the moon drifted like a pale coin over the sleeping land. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of rain and stone. Across the darkened plain, ancient tombs stood half buried in the earth, their shapes softened by centuries of dust and silence. The grass swayed in slow waves, whispering secrets to the wind, and somewhere among those mounds of forgotten kings, a lantern flickered. Its glow trembled as though afraid to disturb the dead. The night itself seemed to hold its breath, listening for footsteps that no longer existed. In the distance, the ruins of a city loomed, once called the Jewel of the South, now a graveyard of broken towers. The old cathedral's spire leaned like a finger pointing toward the heavens, defiant against time. Beneath its crumbling arches lay the crypts of rulers whose names had long since faded from the tongues of men. They had built their empire on faith in death, believing the afterlife could be bargained with, appeased, controlled. But the stones told a different story. They whispered of oaths betrayed, of fires that never went out, of a girl queen whose shadow lingered even now, centuries later, like a breath on cold glass. Travelers rarely came here. Those who did spoke of strange sounds, a low humming beneath the soil, as if the ground itself remembered the hymns once sung to the gods of decay. Locals refused to set foot near the burial grounds after dusk. They said the dead were restless, that their queen had promised them peace but never delivered it. Children grew up hearing her name in lullabies meant to keep them quiet, the child who declared war on the dead. It sounded like a fairy tale, but the stones disagreed. The stones always remember. A lone figure walked through the mist that night, a historian perhaps, or a dreamer searching for traces of the past. Each step sank softly into the earth, and each echo seemed to awaken the ground. The lantern's light spilled over fragments of carved marble, angels without faces, kings without crowns, inscriptions worn smooth by centuries of wind. There, among the ruins, lay a statue of a child carved in pale stone, her eyes uplifted, her hands reaching toward the sky as though pleading for something that had never come. A crown rested crookedly upon her small head. Moss had crept over her cheeks like tears. The wanderer paused before her, uncertain whether the air was moving or whispering. For an instant, the night grew impossibly quiet, and in that stillness, a sound rose, faint, fragile, like a sigh from beneath the ground. It was neither wind nor echo, but something older. It carried the cadence of language, of memory. And though it could not be understood, it felt like a story struggling to surface, a truth half buried in time. The wanderer's heart quickened. In that moment, the legend of the child queen stopped being myth and began to feel like history disguised as a dream. Long before this silence, this land had known light. It had known music and life and the endless ringing of silver bells. But even in its brightest hour, the shadow of death had ruled here. They called it the kingdom of the dead, not because its people were lifeless, but because they lived in fear of what waited after. The priests claimed to speak for the gods of the grave, and the kings built tombs larger than palaces. Death was worshipped as a keeper of order, and to die properly was considered nobler than to live without faith. It was into this world that the child was born, into a culture that believed peace was only possible beneath the earth. And yet, something about her birth changed everything. Some said the stars vanished for a night, others that the river turned black. Her mother, the queen, died as dawn broke, her last cry echoing through the palace halls. The newborn's first breath came as her mother's last faded. The priests declared her touched by both worlds, life and death, and for that, she was both feared and revered. When the bells rang for the coronation of the infant queen, they also tolled for her mother's funeral. It was said the two sounds, joy and mourning, blended so perfectly that none could tell where one ended and the other began. Years later, when the city had fallen silent, the story endured. The air around the tombs still seemed to hum with her defiance. The people who once prayed to the dead now avoided even speaking of them aloud. Still, her legend whispered through the cracks of history, unchanged by time's erosion. Some said she had spoken to spirits, demanding that they let the living be free. Others believed she had ordered the tombs sealed and the shrines burned, declaring that death no longer ruled her kingdom. Whether that war was real or merely symbolic no one knew. But the silence that followed her reign felt unnatural, as though death itself had been wounded and now waited in the dark to heal. A distant thunder rolled over the plains. The lantern trembled again, its flame bending in the wind. The wanderer turned one last time toward the statue of the child queen. Her eyes, though made of stone, seemed to glimmer faintly under the moonlight. Perhaps it was imagination, or perhaps it was memory resurfacing, the faint echo of a voice that once commanded both the living and the dead. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faintest trace of incense, though no fire had burned here for ages. Somewhere far below, in the catacombs where the royal bloodline slept, the air stirred. Dust drifted down like falling ash. A sound, soft as a heartbeat, pulsed in the silence. It might have been nothing more than the settling of stone, or it might have been the beginning of something older awakening. The wanderer lowered the lantern, suddenly aware of how fragile light truly was in the kingdom of shadows. Then the flame flickered out, leaving only the moon to bear witness to the place where history and myth still walked side by side. And so the night continued, long, breathless, full of quiet ghosts. In that silence, the story waited to be told. It waited for a voice to remember her name, for ears to hear how a child once dared to defy eternity. Beneath the whispering tombs, the wind carried her legend like a prayer. She was small, but she was not afraid. She was young, but she stood against forever. And even now, when the world sleeps and the past seems buried, the soil remembers the rhythm of her footsteps, light, certain, and unyielding against the night. Before the child queen's birth, before her name was ever spoken, there lay a kingdom that had forgotten how to breathe without the permission of the dead. It was a land of perpetual dusk, where every sunrise felt like an apology to the graves that lined its hills. The people moved quietly, as though their footsteps might disturb the ancestors sleeping beneath them. Life here was measured not in years but in funerals. A new birth was celebrated only briefly, followed by prayers begging that the newborn's soul remember how to die well when the time came. Death, they believed, was not an ending but a passage, and the dead god, the one they called Merul, watched every heart, weighing its silence more carefully than its deeds. The capital city, Lirith, was beautiful in its decay. It was built of pale stone that gleamed like bone beneath the sun. Towering mausoleums stood side by side with palaces, and even the poorest villagers decorated their doorways with charms carved from grave dust to keep the spirits content. Every home had an altar, and every meal began with an offering to those who no longer breathed. In the great temple at the city's heart, a flame burned day and night, a single, eternal fire said to be lit by the dead god himself. The priests who tended it wore robes the color of ash, their faces hidden behind masks shaped like skulls. They spoke softly, with voices like smoke, promising peace to the obedient and punishment to the faithless. No one dared question them. The priests ruled as surely as the kings, and sometimes more completely. When famine came, it was said the dead were displeased. When war broke out, it was blamed on the restlessness of unburied souls. Every sorrow, every misfortune, found its root in the unseen world beneath. The people did not fear disease or hunger as much as they feared being forgotten after death. To be unburied was the worst fate imaginable, the spirit condemned to wander between worlds, unheard, unseen, unloved. So they built tombs vast enough to shame the living, monuments of stone and silence that stretched far into the earth. The nobles competed to see who could die most gloriously. They commissioned artisans to carve their likenesses into marble, surrounded by winged guardians. Whole forests were felled to build coffins inlaid with gold. Slaves were buried alive beside their masters so that the afterlife might resemble the court they had known in life. The air reeked of incense and resignation. Even joy was tainted with mourning. Lovers exchanged tokens not of life, but of remembrance. A ring meant to say I love you was also a promise to build a tomb large enough for two. The royal family ruled from a palace that overlooked the necropolis, a sprawling city of the dead that stretched beyond the horizon. It was said that at night, one could hear faint murmurs drifting from beneath its marble gates, like distant conversation. The kings of old believed those whispers were blessings. They would walk through the necropolis alone on the night before their coronation, seeking the counsel of ancestors. Many returned pale and trembling, their eyes haunted, but all claimed to have received divine wisdom. The living, it seemed, could not rule without permission from the grave. The queen who would become mother to the child queen was unlike her predecessors. She was born with a quiet skepticism, a mind sharper than the jeweled daggers carried by her guards. Though she attended every ritual, she often stood apart, watching with a faint sorrow that no one could name. She once wrote in her private diary, a fragment discovered centuries later, "We have made death our god, and in doing so, we have killed the joy of being alive." Her words, had they been known, would have been heresy. Yet in her heart, she could not silence them. Under her reign, the kingdom prospered outwardly. Trade caravans crossed deserts, gold filled the treasury, and the temples multiplied their wealth. But beneath that surface, rot grew. Children were still taught to bow before the graves of their ancestors before speaking to their parents. The priests grew fat on fear. They declared new holy days for mourning, until the calendar had more days of sorrow than celebration. And in the minds of the people, death had ceased to be mystery. It had become law. In the northern provinces, however, whispers began to stir. A few scholars and healers began to question the priest's authority, arguing that life itself was sacred and that death, while inevitable, should not be worshipped. They were branded as deniers of the soul and vanished soon after. But their ideas lingered like smoke, faint, elusive, impossible to contain. Some of those ideas reached the queen, who listened in secret. She began to imagine a world where children learned to honor the living before they honored the dead, where beauty did not belong only to tombs and epitaphs. She dreamed of rebirth, of sunlight. When she fell pregnant, the priests declared it a divine omen. They read the movement of crows and the alignment of stars, proclaiming that the child would either save the kingdom or destroy it. Such prophecies were common, but this one spread like wildfire. The people, wearied by endless rituals, longed for a change they did not dare name. They began to whisper of renewal, though they spoke those words only in the safety of darkness. The queen's pregnancy became not just a matter of bloodline, but of destiny. As her belly grew, strange signs appeared. The eternal flame in the temple flickered for the first time in living memory. Graves cracked open after storms, revealing bones that should have been sealed forever. The priests declared these signs to be warnings, that the child's birth would anger the dead god. The queen, however, saw them differently. She told her closest maid, "Perhaps it is not the child who brings unrest. Perhaps the dead themselves are tired of ruling." By the time the queen went into labor, the city's bells had begun to toll in confusion, half for celebration, half for fear. The skies turned red with dust, and lightning danced without thunder. The priests filled the palace halls with chants meant to appease the unseen. Somewhere beyond those walls, the citizens knelt in their homes, torn between hope and dread. For in this kingdom, life was never just life. Every beginning was a trespass against the dead. And so the stage was set, a realm that had built its faith upon graves, a people chained to their ancestors, and a crown heavy with centuries of superstition. The land waited, suspended between devotion and decay, for the arrival of the child who would change everything. The air itself felt charged, like the pause before a storm. Beneath the tombs, perhaps even the dead were listening. They too must have felt it, the tremor of something new, something alive, moving quietly toward them through the darkness of time. She was born beneath a sky the color of ashes, as though the heavens themselves hesitated to witness what they had allowed into the world. The storm that night had begun before sunset and showed no sign of ending. Thunder rolled like drums of mourning across the plains, and the palace torches flickered under the breath of the wind. Within the queen's chambers, the midwives worked in silence. The air was thick with incense and fear. The old priest of Merle stood near the door, his face hidden by his ivory mask, muttering prayers that sounded more like warnings. When the first cry of the infant pierced the storm, the priest flinched as if struck. The queen's final breath followed moments later. Her eyes, wide and glassy, stared at the ceiling as though trying to glimpse a heaven that refused her. They said the child's first breath and the mother's last had overlapped perfectly, one life replacing another in a single heartbeat. The priest declared it a sign, She has stolen her mother's soul to enter this world. She will not belong to the living or the dead." The servants lowered their heads, too afraid to answer. Outside, the thunder grew louder, echoing through the marble corridors like the footsteps of something unseen. The newborn was small, pale, and strangely quiet once the first cry had passed. Her hair, dark as wet ink, clung to her scalp. When the nursemaid tried to close her tiny fist, she found the child's hand already clenched around a piece of torn silk from her mother's death shroud. No one could explain how it had gotten there. They named her Lysandra, the name chosen by the queen in her final letter, meaning the one who frees. It was whispered that perhaps her mother had known what the child would become. At dawn, the storm ceased as suddenly as it had begun. The clouds parted to reveal a blood-red sunrise that painted the palace walls in the color of rusted iron. The priests took it as an omen of imbalance, a warning that the boundaries between worlds had thinned. But among the people, there was quiet awe. Some claimed they heard voices in the wind, whispering blessings. Others said the statues of the ancestors wept tears of dew. Whatever truth lingered behind those tales, the birth of Lysandra was not forgotten. It was said that even the dead turned in their graves that morning, uncertain whether to bless her or curse her. She grew under the watchful gaze of a kingdom divided between reverence and dread. Every step she took through the palace gardens was accompanied by whispers. The servants crossed themselves when she passed, the guards avoided her eyes. Yet those who were brave enough to approach her spoke of a gentleness that felt otherworldly. She would pause beside wilted flowers and touch them lightly, and by morning they would bloom again. The priests forbade talk of miracles, but such things spread faster than fire in a dry field. By the age of 5, she began asking questions that unsettled her tutors. "Why do we pray to the dead?" she would ask. "Do they still hear us, or do we only hear ourselves?" Her governess, terrified of blasphemy, tried to hush her, but the child continued. "If the dead rule us, then who rules them?" The questions echoed in the candlelit chambers, unanswered. The priest assigned to her education described her as bright as a sword and twice as dangerous. Her days were filled with lessons about etiquette and ritual, but her nights belonged to curiosity. She would wander through the silent corridors after midnight, barefoot, her small lantern casting trembling light on the walls. The palace was old, built over catacombs that stretched for miles, and the floors sometimes breathed, subtle tremors of the earth or perhaps the stirring of something beneath. Once, a guard found her standing before a sealed door deep in the lower hall. When he asked what she was doing, she replied softly, "Listening. They're talking down there, but only when it's dark enough." The next day, that guard requested a transfer. When she turned 8, the council gathered in the Hall of Veils to decide her future. The kingdom had been leaderless since the queen's death, and though the priests insisted on waiting for divine approval, the people grew restless. Famine had struck the northern fields, and the temples grew richer while the poor starved. Rumors spread that the crops were dying because the dead demanded greater offerings. The priests urged submission, the nobles demanded a ruler. At last, the high priest announced that Marul had spoken through an omen. A crow found dead yet breathing, its eyes open but its heart still. "The child," he declared, "is both death and life. She shall reign until the boundary is restored." Thus, in a ceremony equal parts coronation and funeral, Lysandra was crowned queen of the dead and the living. She sat upon a throne carved from obsidian, the same stone used to seal tombs. Her crown was too heavy for her small head, and the robe trailed across the floor like a river of shadows. The crowd watched in silence, torn between awe and unease. Bells tolled not in celebration but in mourning, their sound deep and hollow. Even the air in the hall seemed reluctant to move. As she raised her hand, a gesture she had been taught to mimic, the torches flickered, and a cold wind swept through the room. Some said it was merely the draft from the open doors. Others swore they saw the faint silhouettes of ghostly hands brushing against her crown. The priests fell to their knees. The high priest's voice trembled as he proclaimed, "May she bring balance to the restless and peace to the living." But the people outside whispered something else. "May she live long enough to understand what she has inherited." That night, The child queen stood at her balcony, looking down upon the city. Thousands of lanterns glowed like captive stars. Beyond the palace walls stretched the necropolis, its endless tombs silver under the moonlight. Somewhere among them, her mother's grave waited, silent and alone. The wind carried faint chanting from the temples, the same words repeated since time immemorial, "All things serve death." The phrase settled over her like a shroud. For a long while, she said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she replied to no one and everyone, "Not me." It was the first rebellion, quiet as a breath yet powerful enough to tremble the future. Those who served her would later swear that on that night, the moon dimmed for a moment, as though the world itself paused to listen. And somewhere deep beneath the palace, the crypts groaned like something ancient shifting in its sleep. The war between life and death had not yet begun, but its first heartbeat had already sounded, in the chest of a child no older than 8, who looked upon the kingdom of the dead and refused to bow. The first year of her reign passed in uneasy quiet. The priests performed endless rituals to keep the spirits appeased, and the nobles offered costly sacrifices, but the land itself seemed restless. Crops withered before harvest, rivers swelled and then dried overnight, and whole flocks of crows gathered on the palace walls as though watching. The people began to whisper that the boundaries between the living and the dead were weakening. Children woke screaming from dreams of gray faces pressing against their windows. Dogs howled at shadows that no one could see. In every corner of the kingdom, fear ripened like fruit left too long in the sun. Then came the night that would divide history in two, the night of the Pale Procession. It began, as many calamities do, in silence. The air turned still just after dusk. The usual hum of crickets vanished, the wind halted, and even the torches burned without movement. The moon hung enormous and white above the city, bathing the rooftops in a light too bright, too cold. At first, the watchman on the southern wall saw only a shimmer along the horizon, a ripple like mist rising from the riverbanks. They thought it was fog, though no fog had ever climbed so high or moved with such deliberate slowness. As it neared, they saw shapes within it, rows upon rows of figures, pale and indistinct, moving with a rhythm that was neither walk nor march but something between. The bells of the lower quarter began to toll, not from command but from panic. The priests rushed into the streets carrying their lanterns of sanctified oil. The nobles sealed their gates. From the palace balcony, Queen Lysandra stood barefoot, wrapped in a thin white cloak, watching the approach of the procession. Her advisors begged her to return inside, but she did not move. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, fixed on the silver tide rolling toward the city walls. She whispered something, so soft that even those beside her could not hear it. "They're not coming for war. They're coming to be remembered." The gates of Lyrith were shut, but the fog did not stop. It poured over the ramparts like a living river. The guards fled, some dropping their spears, others falling to their knees as the first of the figures emerged. They were not soldiers, nor were they whole. Their faces were hollow where eyes should have been, their garments tattered funeral cloths that fluttered though there was no wind. Some carried the remnants of banners, others dragged chains that made no sound. And yet, despite their ghastly appearance, they did not attack. They walked, endlessly, slowly, a line of the forgotten returning home. From the palace steps, the queen descended alone. Her advisors shouted after her, but she did not hear. The mist curled around her ankles like breath, and the cobblestones glowed faintly beneath her bare feet. She moved through the silent streets until she stood before the procession. One of the apparitions halted. Its head tilted as if studying her. In that instant, the queen felt the weight of centuries pressing against her chest. She recognized faces she had seen only in paintings, kings, queens, and warriors from her own bloodline, their features blurred by time. They said nothing, but their silence spoke louder than any curse. A single tear traced her cheek, not from fear but understanding. These were not monsters, they were memories. The dead had come not to destroy but to remind, to reclaim what had been lost to superstition and fear. Yet the living saw only horror. Panic spread like wildfire. The priests ordered the soldiers to light the sacred oil, and flames burst across the outer streets. The fog glowed orange and red, and the air filled with the scent of burning cloth. The procession did not scream, but their outlines flickered and faded as if pain itself had no voice. Lysandra fell to her knees, crying out for them to stop, but her words drowned beneath the roar of fire. When the last of the pale figures vanished, the city stood silent once more, its streets littered with ash. The wind returned, carrying with it a sound like faint weeping. The people stayed hidden in their homes until dawn, afraid to look outside. When the sun finally rose, they found the stones cold to the touch, slick with dew that resembled tears. The priests proclaimed that the dead god had tested them, that the queen's presence had provoked the restless. They demanded greater sacrifices to restore balance. But the queen could not forget what she had seen. For days she refused food or counsel, locking herself in her chambers. Servants claimed to hear her murmuring to unseen visitors, her tone calm, sorrowful. One night, her chamberlain found her standing before a mirror, whispering, "They are not gone. They wait just beyond the veil." She began to order changes in the palace. The burning of incense banned, the closing of tombs halted. When the priests protested, she answered quietly, "We cannot worship peace if it must be bought with fear." In the weeks that followed, strange things occurred. The fires in the temples would not stay lit. The sacred flame, said to burn eternally, sputtered and died. Birds began nesting atop the tombs that had once been considered too holy to touch. The common folk, seeing these signs, grew divided. Some believed the queen had angered the gods and that another procession would come, this time to claim the living. Others believed she was chosen to end the curse that had haunted the kingdom for generations. One evening, as dusk painted the sky with bruised colors, the queen summoned her closest advisor, an old historian named Marin. "Tell me," she asked him, "when did we begin to worship what we fear?" The man hesitated, unsure if it was a test. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "the moment we forgot how to remember with love." Lysandra nodded. "Then I will remind them," she replied, "even if I must walk through the tombs myself." The legend of the pale procession spread beyond Lyrith, carried by travelers and merchants, reshaped by each retelling. Some said the dead had marched to reclaim their queen. Others claimed she had walked among them as one of their own. What truly happened that night remained a mystery. But from that moment onward, nothing in the kingdom was the same. The line between myth and history blurred, and a child who should have ruled from behind silken curtains found herself standing against forces far older than her throne. And though the fires of that night had long cooled, the scent of smoke lingered in the city for years, a reminder that the dead had once walked beneath the moon and that a child's defiance had stirred them from their eternal rest. The pale procession had ended, but its echo endured, winding through the hearts of the living like a forgotten song that no one dared to sing aloud. The months after the pale procession were marked by a heavy stillness that seemed to settle over everything. The city of Lyrith, once vibrant with the hum of markets and the rhythm of temple bells, grew quiet and watchful. The people spoke in whispers, afraid that even their words might summon the things they had seen. The priests doubled their rituals, their voices hoarse from constant chanting. Smoke from endless offerings darkened the temple ceilings until even the golden idols appeared tarnished. But Queen Lysandra, who had once stood trembling before the specters of her ancestors, no longer shared the fear that ruled her people. Something inside her had changed the night the dead returned. It was as if the veil between her thoughts and the unseen world had thinned, allowing her to hear whispers no one else could. She began walking alone through the palace gardens long after midnight, barefoot and silent, her white robes trailing in the dew. Servants who glimpsed her said she spoke softly to the air, pausing now and then as if listening to a reply. Once, a guard swore he saw faint lights glimmering around her, like fireflies caught in a slow dance. When he blinked, they were gone. The council grew uneasy. They whispered that the queen was losing her mind, that perhaps the spirits had marked her that night and refused to release her. The high priest of the flame demanded that she submit to purification, but she refused, saying only, "You cannot cleanse what is already awake." At first, her behavior could be dismissed as grief or fatigue, but soon her dreams began to leak into the waking world. She ordered the palace's west wing reopened, the one sealed since the death of her father, and had the portraits of past monarchs cleaned and restored. She commanded that the ancient tombs beneath the city be mapped anew, every corridor recorded, every forgotten name rewritten. "We bury our history," she told her scholars, "and then call it sacred. But memory should not rot underground." Her words unsettled many, especially the priests who had long guarded those catacombs. One night, under a waning moon, Lysandra gathered a small group of attendants and descended into the tombs herself. The torches sputtered in the damp air, casting trembling shadows on the carved walls. The queen moved slowly, her hand grazing the stone as though tracing the lines of a face. She paused before a great door etched with a symbol none could read. "This," she said, "was the first gate, the place where our covenant began." Her attendants exchanged nervous looks. "Majesty," one whispered, "these halls were sealed for a reason." Lysandra turned to her, her eyes calm but ancient. "Yes," she said softly. "They were sealed to keep us ignorant." When the door opened, a gust of cold air swept through the passage. Inside was not a tomb, but a hall, vast and circular, lined with pillars carved into the likeness of men and women who had ruled long before her time. Between them, faint lines of silver light threaded through the floor, converging on a raised platform at the center. Upon it rested a mirror, its surface black and still. "The Mirror of Names," Lysandra whispered, though she could not say how she knew its title. The others hesitated, unwilling to approach, but the queen stepped forward and placed her palm upon the surface. The moment her skin met the mirror, the air shivered. Every torch flickered, and the faint silver veins along the floor flared like lightning. The attendants fell to their knees as a soft hum filled the chamber, a sound more felt than heard. The mirror rippled, and faces began to emerge within it, hundreds of them, blending and shifting like clouds in water. Lysandra saw kings, warriors, and children. Some smiled, others wept. A woman's voice echoed in her mind, "You opened what was forgotten. Do not close it again." When the light faded, the mirror stilled, and in its reflection, the queen saw not herself but the pale procession, walking once more through the streets of Lyrith, not in anger, but in sorrow. After that night, the queen forbade anyone from entering the tombs without her. The priests accused her of blasphemy, warning that she was meddling with forces meant to remain buried. "Burial is not silence," she replied. "It is conversation interrupted." Her tone was not defiant but filled with quiet conviction. Rumors began to spread among the people. Some said she had become a medium between worlds, able to speak with the dead who had once walked beside her. Others claimed that she no longer slept, that her soul wandered through dreams too vast for mortal minds. When spring came, the queen ordered the rebuilding of the ruined districts. Instead of temples, she built gardens. Instead of altars, she raised monuments inscribed with names, not of gods, but of the dead themselves. "If we remember them," she said to the confused masons, "they do not need to march again." The priests, furious, declared her decrees heretical. They called her the unbound queen, accusing her of breaking the covenant between life and death. Yet the common folk began to love her in secret. They said she brought warmth back to a kingdom long ruled by fear. Mothers whispered her name to calm crying infants. Old men placed candles by their doors at night, murmuring blessings to the queen who walks with ghosts. But such peace could not last. The high priest gathered his followers and preached that darkness had taken root in the palace. He claimed that the queen's communion with the dead had awoken something ancient and hungry beneath the earth. "The veil has been torn," he cried to the crowd, "and soon the dead will not come to be remembered, they will come to feed." His words spread like infection. Suspicion returned to the streets, sharper this time. People began to vanish from the lower quarters. Grave robbers, vagrants, those who slept near the old tombs. The priests said the dead were taking them as punishment. But the queen believed otherwise. In the depths of night, she visited the Mirror of Names again. The hall greeted her with silence. The mirror stood dark, reflecting only her pale face. She whispered, "If I have disturbed you, forgive me. Tell me what I must do." The surface trembled faintly, and from the blackness, a single phrase emerged like breath upon glass. The living forget too easily. The queen closed her eyes, tears forming. Then I will not forget, she swore. Not even if it costs me everything. Days later, the priests demanded her abdication. The council refused to defend her. Only Marin, the old historian, stood by her side. You have seen what no one else dares to see, he told her. But truth is a dangerous inheritance. Lysandra smiled faintly. Then I will inherit it alone. That night, lightning struck the highest spire of the temple, and the eternal flame within went out forever. To the people, it was a sign, proof that the gods had turned away. But to Lysandra, it was liberation. The world no longer burned with the false light of fear. Only the soft glow of memory remained. And as thunder rolled across the valley, she stood at her window, whispering to the unseen horizon, "Let them walk again if they must. This time, we will not run." The morning after the temple burned, the kingdom woke to silence. Smoke still curled above the city's rooftops, drifting like black ribbons into the dawn. The priests were gone. Some fled, others vanished without trace, and the people waited, uncertain whether to mourn or to rejoice. The great flame that had once been their god's voice was now only ash. But from the palace balcony, Queen Lysandra stood calm, watching the first light spill over the ruins as if dawn itself had chosen her side. Her eyes, weary yet resolute, reflected the fire's last embers. "Let the dead speak if they must," she whispered to Marin, who stood beside her. "But let the living finally listen." That day marked the beginning of her most daring decree. All temples were to be closed, their relics sealed away. In their place, she ordered the creation of the Hall of Echoes, a vast circular structure where the names of every citizen, dead or living, would be carved into the marble walls. "The dead are not gods," she said before the gathered council. "They are memory, and memory belongs to all of us." Her words spread quickly, carried by those who had lost more than faith, those who had lost children, lovers, or whole lineages to war and plague. To them, the hall was not blasphemy but mercy. It was a promise that they, too, would be remembered. Construction began under her direct supervision. The hall was built upon the edge of the old necropolis, where the river wound through fields of bone-white lilies. Workers unearthed coffins older than the kingdom itself, and Lysandra ordered each to be reburied with their names restored. When they found graves without inscriptions, she had blank stones placed, saying softly, "Even those forgotten deserve a mark." The people began to visit the site, leaving offerings not of gold or incense but of small, personal things: locks of hair, trinkets, scraps of parchment with names written in trembling hands. The sound of chisels cutting into stone became the city's new prayer. But the deeper they dug, the stranger the earth became. Beneath the lilies, beneath the layers of old graves, they found a chamber carved in perfect symmetry. The walls shimmered faintly, as though touched by moonlight even in darkness. At its center stood an obelisk of obsidian, its surface etched with spirals that seemed to move when stared at too long. Lysandra descended into that chamber herself, her lantern's flame bending oddly as if resisting the place. "It feels awake," she murmured. Marin urged caution, but she only smiled, touching the cold stone. The spirals pulsed faintly under her fingers, and a voice, neither male nor female, whispered through the air, "You would bridge the silence?" She froze. The voice was not in her ears, it was within her mind. "You would call them back?" It asked again, gentle yet terrible. "No," she whispered aloud. "Not call. Understand." There was a pause, then a faint laughter like the rustle of dry leaves. "Then you will bear their weight." The lantern went out. When it flared to life again, the obelisk spirals had rearranged, forming the shape of an eye. From that day on, the queen's dreams were no longer her own. Night after night, visions came, of cities older than her own, of empires swallowed by dust, of monarchs who made pacts with shadows and called them gods. She saw how each age built monuments to death and called it devotion, how fear had always been the crown worn by kings. And through it all, she heard one refrain: the dead do not hate the living. They only wait to be remembered. When she awoke, she began to write feverishly, filling scroll after scroll with what she saw. These writings would later become known as the Book of Bridges, a collection of parables that blurred the line between life, memory, and resurrection. The council begged her to stop. They feared what her words might inspire. But the people were already listening. Every night, hundreds gathered outside the palace gates, asking to hear the new passages. The queen would appear on the balcony, reading by lantern light in a calm, lilting voice. She spoke of unity between the seen and unseen, of compassion as the only weapon against decay. Her words fell like soft rain upon parched hearts. For the first time in generations, the city of Lirith knew peace, not from the threat of gods, but from the comfort of remembrance. Yet beneath the peace, something stirred. Strange lights began to flicker near the Hall of Echoes after midnight, blue-white orbs drifting like lost souls. The workers swore they heard faint murmurs in the marble, like thousands of voices whispering their names. Some said they saw shapes moving between the pillars, figures that bowed in silence when approached. Fear began to creep back into the people's hearts. "You have opened the way too wide," Marin warned. "You spoke to the dead, and now they answer." Lysandra looked at him with sadness. "Would you rather they be silent forever?" she asked. He could not reply. One evening, the queen returned to the underground chamber beneath the lilies. The obelisk pulsed faintly in the dark, the eye-shaped pattern watching her. "I kept my promise," she said softly. "I remembered them." The voice replied, faint and cold as mist, "Remembrance is not peace. You woke what does not sleep." The ground trembled, and cracks began to crawl up the stone pillars. A low hum filled the air, and from the fissures, faint streams of light seeped upward. Lysandra fell to her knees, tears mixing with the dust. "If this is the price of memory," she whispered, "then let it be mine to pay." The light spread across the floor like veins, climbing the walls until the entire chamber glowed. For a heartbeat, it seemed the world itself held its breath. Then the light vanished, leaving the obelisk silent once more. When the queen emerged, dawn had broken. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with quiet resolve. She ordered the Hall of Echoes completed without delay. The final stones were laid within the week, and when the last name was carved, the ground beneath Lirith stilled, as if exhaling after a long-held breath. The orbs vanished. The murmurs faded. Peace, fragile yet real, returned. And for a brief time, the living and the dead seemed to share the same rhythm again. But Marin saw what others did not. He noticed how the queen's hands trembled when she thought no one was watching, how her reflection no longer matched her movements in the mirror. "You have given too much," he said quietly one evening. She smiled faintly. "Perhaps. But at last they rest." She looked out across her sleeping city, the soft glow of the hall reflected in her eyes. "And if I must bear their dreams to keep them so, then I will not wake." The days that followed were filled with a strange, golden calm. The city of Lirith no longer reeked of incense and fear. The air itself seemed lighter, cleaner, as if some invisible weight had finally lifted. The bells that once rang for death now chimed for birth. Children played near the fountains again, and laughter returned to streets long haunted by silence. The Hall of Echoes stood gleaming at the city's heart, its marble walls alive with sunlight and the faint shimmer of carved names. For the first time in centuries, the people believed they had conquered death, not through defiance, but through remembrance. Yet beneath that fragile peace, an unseen current began to stir. Queen Lysandra no longer appeared in public as often. Those closest to her said she was exhausted, her health waning. Others whispered that her mind had become a bridge too wide between the worlds, that her body slept, but her spirit wandered among the departed. The guards who patrolled the palace at night reported hearing soft murmurs behind her chamber doors, voices speaking in ancient tongues, sometimes answering her in unison. Once, a maid claimed to see faint handprints appear on the inside of the queen's window, though no one stood there. When asked about it, Lysandra only smiled, saying, "Even the dead need to feel the sun sometimes." Her dreams had grown longer, deeper. She saw the faces of those she had restored to memory, the kings who once ruled through fear, the nameless peasants buried without song. They gathered in her dreams not as spirits, but as echoes, reflections of the past seeking warmth from the living. They did not speak with malice. They asked her questions instead. Do you remember my son? Do they still tell my story? Does the river still sing? She answered each as best she could, weaving their words into her waking thoughts until dream and reality began to blur. It was during one of these half-dreaming nights that she found herself standing in the Hall of Echoes, though her body still lay in bed. The names carved into the walls glowed faintly, as though breathing. The air shimmered, and the whispers rose in chorus, not mournful but urgent. From the marble floor, a shape began to form, a woman made of shadow and light, neither alive nor dead. Her voice carried the weight of centuries. You have done what none before you dared, she said. You made a bridge, and now the tide comes to cross it. Lysandra felt no fear, only a quiet ache in her chest. Then let it come, she whispered. Let memory flow both ways. When she awoke, the dawn was pale and trembling. Outside her window, mist rolled through the streets, thick and strange, glowing faintly as if filled with stars. The guards reported seeing silhouettes moving within it, familiar faces of those long gone. But there was no terror in the city that morning. Instead, people stood in silence, tears streaming down their faces as they recognized ancestors, friends, lovers lost to time. The dead had not returned as ghosts or wraiths. They appeared as memories given form, as visions shaped from longing. They touched no one, spoke no words, but their presence filled the living with peace so deep it hurt. For one radiant morning, life and death existed together, side by side, like the two halves of a forgotten song. But peace, like all miracles, cannot last. By midday, the mist thickened into storm. The faces began to twist, their forms faltering. The air grew cold, heavy with pressure, and the faint whispers turned into cries. Something was wrong. The bridge between worlds had opened too wide, and not all that came through belonged to memory. In the deepest corners of the hall, the marble cracked, oozing black dust that shimmered like ash. From it came shadows without shape, empty remnants of lives unlived, fragments of fear and regret that had clung to the dead like parasites. They fed on grief, on remembrance itself. And for the first time, Lysandra understood what the voice beneath the lilies had meant. Remembrance was not peace. It was invitation. The queen acted swiftly. She gathered her council and ordered the hall to be sealed until the anomaly could be contained. But as masons worked to close the great bronze doors, screams echoed from within. Those who had stayed inside to complete the inscriptions never came out. Through the cracks, faint blue light pulsed like a heartbeat. The people began to panic, and the priests who had once fled the temple's ruin returned, proclaiming that her mercy had doomed them all. They called her the Queen of Shadows, accusing her of trading the kingdom's soul for her own vision of truth. Lysandra stood before the crowd, her white gown stained with soot from the ceiling fires. "You speak of doom," she said softly, "but you worshipped it first. You feared death so much you gave it power. I have only shown you what it really is." Her voice trembled not with fear, but with exhaustion. "You cannot bury what still breathes in memory. You can only make peace with it." The crowd hesitated. Some lowered their torches, others wept. But the fear that ruled them was older than any faith. That night, the queen went alone to the Hall of Echoes. The guards begged her not to enter, but she smiled faintly and said, "If I made the bridge, then I will be the one to stand upon it." The doors opened at her touch, the air heavy and electric. Inside, the marble walls no longer bore names. They rippled like water, shifting with countless faces. The air smelled of earth and lightning. From the far end of the hall came a deep, rhythmic sound, like the beating of a heart too large for the world. She walked toward it slowly, her bare feet leaving faint prints of light on the floor. "I know you," she whispered. "You are what we feared. You are the hunger that lives between remembering and forgetting." The shadows gathered around her, their forms tightening, coiling. "You took their shape," she said, "but they are not yours to keep." Her voice grew steadier, echoing through the hall like a bell. "They belong to time, not to you." The heartbeat grew louder, faster. The floor trembled. The queen raised her hands, and the spirals from the obelisk appeared faintly across her palms, glowing with silver fire. "If memory is the bridge," she said, "then I will be its keeper." She pressed her hands against the shifting wall, and the light spread outward, filling the chamber. Every name, every whisper, every lost echo flared to life, shining brighter than flame. For a moment, the darkness screamed, not in rage, but in sorrow, then broke apart like glass struck by wind. The light collapsed inward, and silence fell. When the guards forced the doors open at dawn, the hall was empty. The marble was whole again, the names returned to their rightful places. But at the center, where the queen had stood, lay her crown, silver, scorched, and humming faintly with the rhythm of a heartbeat. Some said she had crossed the bridge she built. Others believed she had become the bridge itself. Whatever the truth, the mist that haunted the city vanished with her, and the dead slept quietly once more. In the years that followed, people visited the hall not as pilgrims, but as family. Years passed, and the city of Lirith slowly rebuilt itself around the silence the queen had left behind. The Hall of Echoes remained untouched, no one dared alter a single stone. The marble gleamed white under the sun, and at night it shimmered faintly, as if moonlight lived within it. People said the hall was alive now, that it breathed when the wind moved through its corridors, that it whispered the names of the lost when no one was near. Yet it was not a place of fear. Children played on its steps. Lovers left flowers beside its gates. The dead, it seemed, had finally found peace, and so had the living. But the peace was not effortless. It came at the price of memory, and memory is a weight that never truly rests. Marin, the old historian, lived long enough to see the new age unfold. His beard had turned white, his hands unsteady, yet his mind remained sharp as glass. Each morning he walked the long path to the hall, leaning on a staff carved with the queen's sigil, a pair of spirals bound by a single line. He had been there the night she vanished, had seen the light pour from the marble and the crown that hummed like a heart. To him, the hall was not merely a monument, it was her unfinished sentence, her last breath turned into stone. He spent his remaining years writing the chronicle of the bridge, a record of the queen's reign, her defiance, and her mysterious disappearance. So that when memory fades, he would whisper as he wrote, "It may remember itself again through us." He often spoke to the marble as if it could hear him. Sometimes he swore it answered. Once, during a storm, lightning struck the hall's dome, and instead of shattering, the light diffused through its veins like silver blood. The city awoke to find every carved name glowing softly, illuminating the streets with a gentle radiance. The people called it the Queen's Vigil, believing Lysandra's spirit had returned to watch over them. For 3 nights, the glow remained, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. On the 4th dawn, it faded, leaving behind a sense of serenity that lingered for generations. Under this quiet reign of remembrance, Lirith flourished. The scholars built schools beside the hall, where children learned history not as a list of kings but as a tapestry of lives, every name, noble or common, taught with equal reverence. Farmers brought offerings of grain each harvest to the marble gates, thanking the dead for the soil they had left behind. Even the priests, though humbled, found peace in new rituals that honored memory rather than fear. They no longer prayed for deliverance from death but for understanding of its place in the cycle of life. And in the evenings, when the sun sank behind the western hills, the people gathered in the plazas to sing the Hymn of Names, a song said to have been written by the queen herself before she vanished. Its final line always drew tears, "Those who remember shall never be alone." But with time, the truth of her reign became myth. The story of the child queen who declared war on the dead softened into legend, retold in poems and fireside tales. The scholars tried to preserve her words, but new generations added their own colors, reshaping her memory like clay. Some said she ascended to the heavens, others claimed she wandered the riverbanks in eternal vigil. Only Marin's chronicle held the truest account, yet even he admitted that the final chapter could never be written. History, he said, is only the shadow of memory walking backward. As the decades turned into centuries, the hall remained untouched by decay. Ivy grew across its lower walls but never crept inside. The marble resisted time as if guarded by unseen hands. Travelers from distant lands came to see it, marveling at the way sound carried within, how even a whisper could be heard as if spoken beside one's ear. They called it the living hall, a miracle of both architecture and mystery. Yet the people of Lirith knew better. They called it simply her voice. When storms rumbled across the plains, they said the hall hummed softly in response, as if soothing the sky. Then one winter, an earthquake struck the southern valleys, shaking the foundations of the old necropolis. The city trembled, and though no buildings collapsed, the hall's great doors cracked slightly down the center. When dawn came, people noticed something strange, faint light seeping through the crack, rhythmic and pulsing like breath. The elders debated sealing it, fearing the breach might awaken what had once been silenced. But Marin's successor, a young scholar named Ilara, argued otherwise. "The queen built a bridge," she said. "Perhaps it is not breaking, it is calling." Against the council's caution, she entered the hall alone, carrying only a lantern and a copy of the chronicle of the bridge. Inside, the light was dim, dust hanging in the air like ghosts of sunlight. The marble walls, though cracked, were still warm beneath her fingers. As she walked deeper, she heard the faint echo of footsteps behind her, though she was certain she was alone. "Your Majesty," she whispered, her voice trembling. "If you can hear me, I seek not to disturb you, only to understand." The air seemed to tighten, the silence pressing against her like a heartbeat. Then, faintly, she heard a sound, not a voice, not words, but something softer, the hum of the crown that had once lain at the center. It pulsed faintly from beneath the floor, steady as ever. She knelt, brushing away the dust, and saw faint spirals etched into the stone, the same sigil Lysandra had borne. As she touched them, the hum grew louder, and light rippled outward in silver lines, forming the outline of two hands pressed into the marble. For an instant, Ilara felt warmth, a pulse not her own, a presence vast and calm, like standing beside a sleeping sea. Then a whisper bloomed inside her mind. "The bridge endures. Remember what must be remembered." Tears filled her eyes. She bowed her head and whispered, "Always." The light faded, and the hall fell silent once more. When Ilara emerged, the dawn was breaking over the city. She told no one what she had seen, only that the hall was sound and that the queen's peace remained unbroken. But those who looked closely noticed that her eyes carried the same faint glimmer Lysandra once had, the mark of one who had looked beyond and returned. From that day forward, she became the keeper of names, a title passed down to every generation after her. And so the bridge endured, not of stone or faith, but of memory. When storms came, the people still heard the faint hum beneath the earth, steady and soft, like a mother's lullaby sung through centuries. They no longer feared the dead, for they knew the queen watched still, not as ghost or goddess, but as the heartbeat of remembrance itself. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the wind moved gently through the lilies, it carried her promise once more. Those who remember shall never be alone. In the centuries that followed, the name Lysandra was no longer just spoken in reverence. It became a way of life, a philosophy that guided generations. The scholars of Lirith called it the doctrine of remembrance, teaching that memory was the truest form of immortality. Across the land, temples were replaced by archives, altars by libraries, prayers by written names. Every birth was recorded beside the memory of the dead, binding the living and the lost in a single lineage. The city became a sanctuary for knowledge, its streets filled with soft chanting as scribes recited the chronicles aloud each evening, ensuring no memory faded into dust. The people no longer feared the afterlife because they carried it with them, in words, in stone, in song. Travelers spoke of Lirith as the city where silence had meaning. They described the strange peace that fell upon anyone who stayed within its walls, the way dreams came easier, how even grief felt gentle there. The Hall of Echoes, still untouched by decay, stood at the heart of this serenity. Pilgrims came from distant kingdoms, seeking not miracles of gold or healing but a whisper of understanding. They would sit for hours inside the hall, listening to the faint hum that pulsed beneath the marble floor. Some said it was the queen's heart still beating. Others believed it was the voice of the dead themselves, singing softly so that the living would never forget them. Ilara's descendants, the keepers of names, guarded the hall and maintained its eternal flame. Each keeper added their own writings to the chronicle of the bridge, expanding the story across centuries. What began as Marin's record of a single reign grew into a living testament of humanity's bond with remembrance. The chronicle became sacred not for its divinity but for its truth. It was imperfect, human, full of contradictions and questions. Yet that, the keepers said, was what made it beautiful. To remember perfectly is to lie, Ilara once wrote in her final entry. But to remember sincerely is to love. The world beyond Lirith changed. Kingdoms rose and fell, wars consumed empires, and plagues erased entire dynasties. But the city remained untouched, its walls unbreached, its spirit unbroken. When conquerors came, they found no soldiers waiting, only citizens who greeted them with stories. And somehow, those conquerors always left without bloodshed. There was something disarming about a people who spoke of the past as if it were still alive, who honored even their enemies in the same breath as their heroes. What victory is there, one general wrote, against a people who have already made peace with death? Still, not all was eternal peace. As centuries turned to millennia, new generations began to question the old ways. A young philosopher named Corin emerged from the southern quarters, arguing that remembrance had become a prison. "We live too much in the shadow of the dead," he said in a public address. "We have forgotten how to dream of tomorrow." His words spread like wildfire, especially among the young. They admired Lysandra but resented her ghostly dominion over their lives. What if the bridge she built was not meant to last forever? Corin asked. What if the dead must finally be allowed to rest? The debate divided the city. The old keepers clung to the sacred duty of memory, while the youth demanded liberation from the weight of the past. For the first time in over 1,000 years, the Hall of Echoes became a place of conflict rather than unity. Voices that once recited names now shouted arguments. The marble that had withstood time and storms trembled faintly beneath the strain of division. Ilara's final prophecy, carved into the base of the hall, seemed to awaken once more. When memory becomes burden, the bridge will falter. Corin proposed what he called the cleansing of echoes, a ritual not to destroy the hall but to silence its hum, to release the souls bound within. He believed the queen herself would have wanted it. Lysandra fought not for death or life, he said, but for balance. We must let the cycle continue. The idea terrified the elders. You would sever what she built, cried the keeper of that age. You would unmake her gift. But Corin's conviction was unshakable. On the eve of the ritual, thousands gathered outside the hall, some carrying candles to protect the memory, others carrying torches to set it free. As the night deepened, a storm gathered, fierce and electric. The crowd's voices rose with the wind, chants, pleas, prayers, defiance, all swirling together into something primal. Corin stood at the steps of the hall, drenched in rain, holding a shard of crystal said to resonate with the queen's crown. He lifted it high and spoke into the storm. If remembrance is love, then let love choose its end. Lightning struck, a white flare splitting the sky. The hum beneath the earth surged, louder than it had been in centuries. The hall shuddered, its marble veins glowing once more with silver light. For a heartbeat, all sound vanished. Then the hall spoke, not in words, but in memory. Visions flooded the minds of everyone present. The queen standing at the edge of her childhood palace, the moment she declared war on death, the faces of every soul she ever vowed to protect. It was as if the past itself unfurled before them. Corin fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. He saw Lysandra, not as myth, but as the fragile, fierce child she once was. She looked at him, her eyes ancient and kind, and whispered, "It was never meant to bind, only to remind." Then the light faded, and the hum grew still. When dawn came, the hall stood silent for the first time in recorded history. The crack that had once split its doors was gone. Inside, the marble glowed faintly, not with sound or power, but with warmth. The people entered quietly, fearing what they might find, but there was no death, no ruin, only peace. The air felt lighter, the silence soft, like the pause between heartbeats. The keepers declared that the bridge had not been destroyed, only transformed. The dead were no longer bound, they had been released into the flow of remembrance itself. Memory, they said, had finally learned to rest. Corin disappeared that morning. Some said he ascended with the light. Others claimed he wandered into the western hills to live out his life in solitude. But his name was recorded beside Lyssandra's in the chronicle of the bridge, not as her challenger, but as her completion. For every age, it seemed, the bridge must be tested anew, not to prove its strength, but to remind the living why it was built. And so, the people of Lyrith entered a new dawn, not one ruled by memory, nor freed entirely from it, but balanced upon it like breath between two heartbeats. The hall stood, quiet and eternal, reflecting the sunrise in its marble skin. Those who passed by swore they could still feel the faint echo beneath their feet, not a hum this time, but the rhythm of a story still being told. Generations passed like gentle tides against the shores of eternity. The city of Lyrith entered an age of quiet brilliance, a civilization of thought rather than conquest. Scholars, dreamers, and wanderers came from across the lands to learn from the people who had made peace with the shadows of death. They came seeking not gold nor dominion but understanding. The streets were lined with gardens where memory trees grew, their silver leaves humming faintly in the evening breeze. Each leaf bore a name etched by hand, the writing so fine it shimmered like dew under moonlight. It was said that when a breeze passed through those trees, it carried the voices of those who had once been remembered, gentle whispers weaving between the branches like a lullaby of time. The keepers of names had evolved into something more profound. They were not simply historians now, but mediators between the living and the unseen rhythm of memory that pulsed beneath the world. They believed that every soul once remembered with love became part of a great current, a river of consciousness that flowed endlessly through all living things. From this philosophy grew the Order of the Silent Quill, a group of chroniclers who vowed to write without bias or pride, only truth. Their symbol was the same twin spiral that had once adorned the Queen's banner, but now drawn as two hands, palms open, facing upward to the sky. To write, they said, is to remember. To remember is to give life again. At the heart of this era stood the Hall of Echoes, still whole, still quiet. After Corin's awakening, it had ceased its ancient hum, but something deeper had taken its place. Those who entered swore they felt their thoughts slow, their hearts settle, as if the very air held a pulse of serenity. Some claimed to see faint glimmers in the marble, soft ripples of light that appeared when they spoke the name of someone long gone. The hall had become a mirror for memory itself. It reflected not the dead, but the truth the living carried within them. For 1,000 years, it remained untouched, a sanctuary for those seeking to listen to what could not be spoken. But even peace, no matter how pure, eventually meets the weight of time. Beyond Lyritha's borders, the world was changing once more. The age of empires returned, driven by hunger and invention. Machines of iron and steam began to reshape the lands, and the new kings of distant realms looked upon Lyrith with envy. To them, the city's serenity was not wisdom, it was weakness. Armies began to gather at its borders, drawn by rumors that the marble of the hall was made from a stone that could never break, that within its foundations lay a power that could conquer death itself. The keepers denied such claims, but greed rarely listens to truth. The first attack came under a red sky. The invaders marched with banners of flame and engines of steel, their footsteps trembling the ground. The people of Lyrith did not raise weapons. They stood in silence before their gates, candles in hand, singing the hymn of names. The melody drifted through the smoke, haunting and calm. The soldiers hesitated, unnerved by the stillness of their enemies. When they reached the hall, the commander demanded its opening. The keeper of that age, a woman named Sarah, stood before the doors and said, "What you seek cannot be taken. What you destroy will only be remembered." The commander, furious, struck her down with his blade. The crowd did not scream. Instead, they knelt and whispered her name. In that moment, the hall's marble flared with silver light once again. A wind unlike any other swept through the battlefield. The air shimmered, and every soldier froze as they heard voices, Not shouts, not wails, but thousands of overlapping whispers, calm and sorrowful. They felt memories not their own. A mother's lullaby, a child's laughter, a soldier's prayer before death. The weight of remembrance crushed the will to fight. Some dropped their weapons and wept. Others turned and fled, unable to bear the tenderness of what they had felt. By dawn, the invaders were gone. The city stood untouched. Sarah's body was carried into the hall and laid beside the ancient crown that no longer glowed but still pulsed faintly with warmth. The people said the queen had spoken again, not through sound, but through the echo of love. For the next centuries, no one dared challenge Lirith again. Yet the people knew that their peace was not invincible. It had to be nurtured, tended, renewed with each generation. They established the Festival of Whispers, held once every decade. On that night, the city fell completely silent. No bells, no songs, no words. Only the sound of breath and wind through the trees. It was said that during that silence, the veil between memory and life grew thin, and the people could feel the presence of those they had lost walking among them. Some felt a touch on their shoulder, others saw faint figures in the mist, and all felt a warmth within their chest, a shared heartbeat echoing across the centuries. Still, questions began to stir among the scholars once more. How long could the bridge endure? Could memory alone sustain a civilization forever? The keepers debated endlessly, some believing the bridge must one day dissolve into pure silence, others arguing that remembrance was eternal. Among them was a young keeper named Alien, a dreamer who often sat at the edge of the hall and wrote of the stars. He believed that the Queen's bridge was not meant to remain bound to earth, that someday, humanity's remembrance would extend beyond death, beyond the world itself. When the stars remember us, he once wrote, we shall have completed her dream. His words were laughed at by some, revered by others, but none forgot them. One night, under a sky awash with silver constellations, Alien vanished. In his chamber, the keepers found his final writing carved into the stone wall. The bridge is open once more. That night, the Hall of Echoes glowed faintly for the first time in centuries. Not bright, not pulsing, but soft and distant, like starlight reflecting on calm water. The city awoke to the sight in silence, and though no one could explain it, all felt the same quiet certainty that the bridge had not ended, nor remained, but ascended. Memory had become part of the universe itself, carried upon the endless wind of time. The next morning, a child was born beneath the shade of the memory trees. She had eyes the color of twilight and a faint spiral mark on her palm. The midwife gasped, whispering an ancient name under her breath, Lysandra. The cycle, it seemed, had turned once more, not as repetition, but as renewal. The bridge endured, invisible yet eternal, stretching now not only between life and death but between past and future, earth and stars, memory and dream. The Empire's golden age, once radiant and seemingly eternal, began to dim in slow, almost imperceptible stages. It did not collapse with the drama of a single battle or the shock of one fatal decision, but rather eroded like a shoreline under the unceasing tide. What had once been unity became a patchwork of competing ambitions, a vast web of interests held together less by loyalty and more by necessity. The grand councils that had once governed with vision now descended into debate and indecision. Voices that once spoke in harmony grew discordant, each advocating for survival in a world that was subtly shifting beneath their feet. The Empire, for all its grandeur, began to turn inward, consumed by the very weight of its own complexity. In the harbors that had once roared with the sounds of industry, change could be felt in the silence between the tides. Fewer ships came home fully laden, and the docks that had been alive with laughter and work began to echo with uncertainty. Sailors told of routes no longer safe, of ports lost to storms, of foreign powers asserting new control over the seas. The merchants, who had once thrived on endless movement, now faced shortages and delays that no amount of planning could fully counter. The wealth that had once flowed like water through the Empire's veins now slowed, pooled, and stagnated in the hands of a few. The once boundless ocean, which had carried the Empire's dreams, began to feel hostile and distant, an expanse no longer conquered, but endured. In the great cities, The signs were quieter but no less telling. Temples still glimmered with gold, and palaces still glittered under torchlight, yet beneath the surface lay discontent. The people, long accustomed to prosperity, began to feel the strain of scarcity. Taxes rose and trade regulations tightened, but even these measures could not restore the easy flow of wealth that had defined earlier generations. Scholars debated in candlelit halls, trying to understand the subtle patterns of decline, while poets whispered laments for the age that seemed to be slipping away. The empire's image of perfection had begun to crack, and through those cracks seeped doubt, fear, and nostalgia for a past that already felt unreachable. The navy, once the embodiment of imperial pride, faced its own reckoning. Ships that had once ruled the waves with unmatched precision now struggled against rivals who had learned from their successes. Enemy fleets, smaller but more agile, began to outmaneuver the empire's heavy vessels. The intricate network of ports and resupply stations that once guaranteed efficiency was now fragmented, plagued by corruption, neglect, and the sheer exhaustion of overextension. Even the shipbuilders, masters of their craft, faced shortages of timber, metal, and skilled labor. The mighty fleets, symbols of control and confidence, became ghostly shadows of their former glory, sailing more to defend what remained than to claim new horizons. For the sailors who still braved the waves, the sea no longer felt like an ally. Storms seemed to grow stronger, currents more unpredictable. Superstitions, once dismissed by officers, began to creep back into everyday speech. Men whispered of omens, unlucky birds, blood-red sunsets, and ghostly lights on the water. The ocean's moods became a metaphor for the empire itself, vast, mysterious, and increasingly beyond comprehension. Yet amidst this uncertainty, there remained moments of breathtaking beauty, sunsets that turned the horizon to gold, quiet nights when stars reflected on calm waters like scattered jewels. It was as though the world itself mourned the empire's fading brilliance, offering fleeting glimpses of serenity before the next storm arrived. Beyond the shores, rival nations stirred. They watched as the empire faltered, testing its defenses with probing attacks, exploiting weaknesses long hidden beneath its facade of invulnerability. Where once fear of reprisal had kept them at bay, now opportunity beckoned. New alliances formed, and trade routes once monopolized by the empire began to shift into foreign hands. The old balance of power was dissolving, replaced by a world that no longer revolved around a single, dominant force. To its rivals, the empire's decline was both an opening and a warning, a testament to the impermanence of supremacy and the way all greatness eventually bends beneath time's unrelenting tide. Within the empire's heart, the cultural pulse still beat, though faintly. Artists painted with melancholy beauty, chronicling the splendor of days past. Musicians composed elegies that carried both sorrow and pride, while storytellers spoke of the early explorers and the first ships that had ventured into uncharted seas. In their art, the people sought both solace and understanding, weaving memory into legacy. Yet even this revival carried a bittersweet tone. The more they celebrated the past, the clearer it became that the future no longer promised the same magnitude of wonder. The empire's greatest strength, its boundless curiosity, had turned inward, reflecting on what had been rather than what might still be. Corruption crept quietly through the institutions that once stood as pillars of integrity. Positions once earned through merit were now bought or traded. Decisions were made not for the common good but for private advantage. The spirit of exploration and innovation gave way to self-preservation and greed. Bureaucrats delayed vital reforms, fearing the loss of their privileges. The empire's brilliance, once fueled by unity and shared vision, dimmed beneath the weight of cynicism and complacency. The ocean that had once symbolized limitless possibility now mirrored this decay, its surface still shimmering, but its depths concealing the wreckage of forgotten ambition. As decades passed, storms, both political and literal, grew more severe. Uprisings flared along the empire's farthest edges, and provinces that had once thrived under imperial guidance now demanded independence. In response, the central authority tightened its grip, sending fleets and legions to restore control. But each act of suppression drained resources further, spreading the military thin and deepening resentment. The empire's reach, once its greatest weapon, had become its weakness. Its leaders could still command the seas, but not the hearts of those who lived upon their shores. What began as a series of small fractures widened into chasms that even the strongest ruler could not bridge. Amidst this turmoil, nature delivered its own final reckoning. A cataclysmic storm struck without warning, vast, unrelenting, and unlike anything seen before. Entire fleets vanished in its fury, swallowed by waves that seemed to rise from the depths themselves. Coastal cities were flooded, harbors destroyed, and thousands of lives lost in a single night. When dawn broke, the ocean was eerily calm, as if nothing had happened, but the empire was forever changed. The storm was not merely a disaster of weather. It was a symbol, a manifestation of all that had gone unheeded, the arrogance of unchecked ambition, the blindness of power, the inevitability of nature's supremacy. In the aftermath, the survivors looked upon their broken world with awe and disbelief. Years passed after the awakening of the Hall, and the legend of Sarai became inseparable from the rhythm of life in Lirith. The world beyond its marble gates began to stir once more, healed but forever changed. Empires that had once worshipped the machine turned their gaze toward remembrance again. The scholars who had dismissed Liritha's quiet ways sent their emissaries to learn from its keepers. They came humbly, no longer as conquerors but as pilgrims, seeking forgiveness for the arrogance of forgetting. And the keepers welcomed them, not with sermons or judgment, but with stories. For that was how peace had always been made in Lirith, not by sword or treaty, but by remembrance shared aloud. Sarai grew older, though her presence seemed untouched by time. She no longer wore the crown, which she had returned to its resting place beneath the hall's central arch. "It belongs to memory," she said when asked. "And I belong only to its song." Each dawn, she would walk the city streets, barefoot, her fingers brushing against the carved names along the walls. She spoke softly to each one, as if greeting old friends. The people adored her not as a queen, but as something gentler, an echo of compassion made flesh. They said that when she smiled, even grief grew lighter, and when she wept, the rain followed. Her voice became the city's heartbeat, calm and eternal, guiding them through an age of luminous quiet. Under her guidance, the keepers established the school of still voices, where children were taught not only the histories of the past but the art of listening, to silence, to memory, to the spaces between thoughts. Lessons were never written in ink but spoken and then remembered by heart. "A word that lives only on paper," Sarai said, "is a body without breath. To remember is to breathe for those who cannot." These teachings spread far beyond Lirith. Across the lands, people began to speak their dead's names aloud again, to plant memory trees, to gather beneath starlight in silence. The old rituals returned, not as superstition, but as truth rediscovered. The bridge between the living and the lost had not only endured, it had expanded across nations. But with peace came a new question. What becomes of remembrance when there is nothing left to mourn? The generations born into Sarai's age knew no war, no famine, no grief. Their lives were gentle, their days serene. Yet in the stillness, some began to wonder what it meant to remember without suffering. They feared that the bridge, though eternal, might one day become a circle with no beginning or end, a harmony so perfect it would forget its own song. Sarai listened to these doubts in silence, for she too had begun to sense the stillness growing deeper, beautiful but hollow. The hum beneath the hall was softer now, its rhythm slower, as if the heartbeat of the world was drifting into a kind of cosmic sleep. One evening, as twilight bathed the city in pale gold, Sarai stood before the hall once more. The marble reflected the fading light like a mirror of eternity. "You have given them peace," said a voice behind her. It was Elian's descendant, a keeper named Taran, who had long studied the stars as his ancestor once had. "But peace is fragile. What if they forget again?" Sarai smiled faintly, her eyes distant. "They will," she said. "All things are forgotten in time. Even love, even light. But forgetting is not the end. It is how remembering begins again." She looked up at the heavens, where the faint shimmer of the celestial bridge still arched between constellations. "That is why it must sleep," she whispered, "so that one day, it may dream again. That night, the stars dimmed slightly, as though veiled behind a soft mist. The air in Lirith grew unusually still. People awoke to find the memory trees shedding their silver leaves, carpeting the streets in shimmering drifts. The hall's light flickered for the first time in centuries. Sarai gathered the keepers within its walls, her expression serene though her eyes glistened with tears. "The bridge must rest," she said. "We have carried remembrance as far as it can go in this form. The world must forget again, to rediscover what it means to remember." Her words frightened them. "If the world forgets," one keeper pleaded, "will not everything we are fade?" Sarai reached out and touched the marble wall beside her. "No," she said softly. "The bridge was never meant to be held. It was meant to flow." As the final leaves fell, Sarai began the ritual of release, a ceremony lost since the days of Lysandra herself. She knelt at the heart of the hall, her hands placed upon the marble floor. The air shimmered, and the faint hum returned, rising slowly into a song of infinite tenderness. It was the sound of every memory that had ever been, merging into one endless note. The people gathered outside felt it in their bones, a vibration that filled them with warmth and sorrow and love all at once. Above them, the stars flared bright, then dimmed again, their light absorbed into the vast hush of the cosmos. The bridge was closing, not as a door, but as an eyelid. The world, it seemed, was ready to dream. When the song ended, the hall fell silent. The marble lost its glow, and the great sigil at its gates faded from sight. The people entered to find Sarai gone. Only her robe remained, folded neatly beside the crown. In its place, a single silver leaf lay upon the floor, pulsing faintly with light. The keepers wept but did not despair. They understood now what she had meant, that memory must rest so that love can awaken anew. They sealed the hall and planted a grove around it, letting nature reclaim what was once sacred stone. Over the next 100 years, the marble was covered by vines, and the hall became one with the earth. In time, the story of the child queen and the echo of memory faded from the world again, becoming myth once more. Children in distant lands would sometimes dream of silver bridges in the sky, of a girl with twilight eyes whispering their names, of a hall that breathed beneath the ground. And though they could not name her, they woke with peace in their hearts and the faint scent of lilies in the air. The bridge had gone to sleep, but it still dreamed, softly, eternally, waiting for the day when humanity would remember once more and call its name again. Centuries passed, and the Hall of Remembrance lay buried beneath the roots of time, hidden beneath forests that whispered ancient lullabies. The world above had changed beyond recognition. Kingdoms had fallen, oceans had shifted, and even the stars in the night sky seemed to hum with new constellations. The bridge that once connected memory and being now slept in silence, its pulse faint but alive, like the heartbeat of something divine that refused to die. The stories of Sarai, the child queen, had drifted into legend, then into dust. Yet sometimes, in moments between dusk and dawn, wanderers felt the faint echo of her voice, a whisper that did not belong to the wind, reminding them that the world was never truly alone. In a distant era, long after the age of empires and machines, the earth was ruled not by kings or scholars but by dreamers. They were known as the echo-binders, people who believed that the dreams of humankind were threads of a single tapestry. They gathered stories, visions, and songs, not to archive them but to keep them alive through retelling. Their leader, a woman named Erin, was unlike any who came before her. She was neither prophet nor queen, but she carried within her a quiet knowing that made even silence seem sacred. In her childhood, she had dreamed often of a marble hall glowing beneath the roots of trees, and of a girl standing at its heart, smiling through tears. That dream had stayed with her through every season of her life. One morning, as the sun rose pale and trembling over the horizon, Erin felt something stir in her chest, a resonance, a soundless call. She followed it into the forests beyond her city, walking for days without rest. The forest seemed alive, guiding her deeper with shifting paths and flickering lights that danced like embers in fog. Finally, she reached a clearing where no birds sang, and the air was heavy with the scent of stone and rain. There, half buried beneath vines and moss, stood the remnants of a grand archway carved from white marble, its surface cracked yet glowing faintly from within. The symbol of the old bridge, long thought lost, was etched upon its center. Erin fell to her knees, trembling, not from fear, but from recognition. The dream was real. She brushed away the earth with her hands, uncovering a series of glyphs, softly pulsing with light as though they had been waiting for her touch. The ground beneath her shifted, and a soft hum rose from the depths. The world around her seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a sigh like the exhale of eternity, the hall awoke. The vines receded. The marble gleamed once more, as though it had never known ruin. A door of light opened before her, and Erin stepped inside. What she saw within defied the language of her time. The walls shimmered with spectral figures, echoes of lives long past, faces both ancient and unborn, all moving within streams of silver light. At the center of the chamber stood the silver leaf that Sarai had left behind, floating above a basin of still water. As Erin approached, the leaf pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. She reached out, and when her fingertips brushed its surface, a flood of memory poured through her. She saw Sarai standing in the same chamber centuries ago, her face radiant with peace. She felt the sorrow of the world before the sleep, the wars, the forgetting, the silence, and then the quiet grace that had followed. Tears streamed down Erin's face as she whispered, "You remembered us." A voice answered from the air itself, soft as a sigh. "No, child. You remembered yourself." The chamber filled with light, and for an instant, time dissolved. Erin stood upon the celestial bridge itself, stretching infinitely between realms of existence, its surface woven from starlight and memory. Across it walked countless souls, those who had lived, those yet to come, all bound by the same pulse. In that moment, Erin understood that the bridge was not a place but a rhythm, a pulse within every living being. It was the song of existence, the eternal conversation between remembering and forgetting, between life and sleep. When she opened her eyes again, she was kneeling beside the basin, the leaf still floating, glowing brighter than before. The hall no longer seemed ancient or foreign. It felt alive, responsive, as though the stones themselves were breathing. She realized then that Sarai had never died. She had become the bridge. Her essence lingered in every echo, in every story ever told. The crown she once laid down was not an end to reign, but a surrender to eternity. Erin returned to her people, carrying with her a new understanding. "We have been living in half-light," she told them. "We dream but do not remember. We live but do not awaken. The bridge is not gone. It is within us, waiting for us to listen." The echo binders built sanctuaries where people could gather to speak their dreams aloud, to record not in ink but in vibration, songs of memory woven into the air itself. They began to sense the hum beneath their feet once more, faint but steady. The hall had reconnected to the world through them. Across continents, the soil warmed, and silver leaves began to sprout from the ground wherever someone spoke a name with love. Years turned into decades, and Erin's people flourished. The bridge no longer belonged to the heavens alone. It had rooted itself into the living world. Humanity had, at last, become both keeper and memory, both dreamer and dream. Erin grew old but never bitter. Often she returned to the forest, sitting by the marble archway, feeling the heartbeat of the earth beneath her palms. One night, as the stars shimmered in quiet recognition, she whispered, "Is this the end?" And a voice answered through the rustle of leaves, "There is no end, only remembering differently." She smiled, her eyes glistening like moonlight. When morning came, her followers found her seated peacefully beneath the arch, her body still but her face serene. In her lap rested the silver leaf, glowing softly once again. The echo binders built a circle of stone around the arch, not as a tomb, but as an open sanctuary. Anyone who entered could hear faint echoes of their own forgotten memories, the murmurs of lives they had once lived or dreamed of. It became a place of pilgrimage for centuries to come, a reminder that memory is not bound by time, nor love by death. And sometimes, when the night grew too still, travelers swore they could hear two voices singing softly within the trees, one of a child queen, the other of a dreamer who found her way home. The harmony lingered long after the wind had passed, weaving itself into the breath of the world, proof that remembrance, once awakened, never truly sleeps again. The centuries folded into themselves, and what had once been legend became the quiet pulse of the world's rhythm. No one spoke Sarai's name anymore, yet her presence was everywhere, woven into the hush between rain and thunder, the shimmer of moonlight upon still water. The silver leaves that had once marked the rebirth of memory now grew wild across forgotten lands, whispering softly whenever the wind passed through them. Children born in distant eras dreamed of bridges of light, of queens made of starlight and sorrow, though they did not know why. The hall of remembrance had long since dissolved into earth and stone, but its spirit had merged with the living world, alive in every breath, in every story shared around a quiet fire. In a time when the world was no longer ruled by empires or borders, humanity learned to move gently again. They spoke not to conquer but to remember. Villages grew around the old forest, not for worship but for peace. On nights when the stars gathered thick and bright above, people would close their eyes and hum softly, feeling something ancient answer in return. It was the bridge, no longer a path between realms, but a melody that lived within them all. Some said that if you stood beneath a silver-leaf tree at dawn, you might see a flicker in the air, the faint image of a young girl standing at the edge of the horizon, smiling as if she had always known you. And perhaps she had. For memory does not fade. It transforms, reshapes, and becomes the world it once sought to preserve. Sarai's war on the dead had never been one of violence, but of love against forgetting. And in the stillness of eternity, love had won. The world now rests in quiet harmony, the bridge between life and memory pulsing like a soft heartbeat beneath every moment. The story of Sarai is no longer legend but lullaby, carried in wind, in rivers, in the hush before dawn. Each breath taken by the living hums with the rhythm of those who came before, and each dream whispers her name in gratitude. The war on the dead was never one of swords, but of forgetting, and she, the child queen, ensured the world would never sleep in silence again. Memory endures, gentle and eternal,